quite an involved process deciding who to actually interview for the project. We've always had the overall idea that this is going to be an overall history of British science. There's going to be a little bit of everything there. A lot of different fields, a lot of different people who've worked in different capacities. So lab technicians to professors and chief government scientists, the whole spectrum and the whole breadth of it. We've been guided quite a lot by our advisory committee, which is made up of scientists, actual scientists now, historians, science writers, and of course the project interviewers themselves, who are going around and doing quite a bit of extra research as they go through researching new topic areas. Sometimes interviewees will actually suggest interviewees themselves. For instance, they might suggest a lab technician they've been working with, some person who we wouldn't have actually managed to pick up through the documentation or from any other mechanism. So that's a really good way of snowballing extra interviewees.
For some of them, like oceanography, we thought about the ocean and thought about the different bits of it and interviewed scientists who were themselves interested in different bits of the ocean. Someone who was interested in the ocean floor, someone who was interested in the currents, someone who was interested in the waves, another person who was interested in the surface, and so on. For other disciplines, the names sort of suggested themselves because there were key developments in the earth sciences at the time and there were key names attached to those developments, such as plate tectonics, the revelation that the earth is made up of a number of plates. There were a number of scientists who just were the key people in the development of that part of science. To some extent that was the same for climate change, although in that case we made a conscious decision not only to focus on sort of famous climate scientists, but also people working more generally in climate science as a whole. So we picked statisticians who were looking at sort of meteorological variables and weather maps, and a whole host of people who were looking at climate history.
Once we've decided to actually interview someone, there's quite a long process that follows that. Firstly, you're always trying to sort of work out when's the best time to approach them. So you've typically got several interviews on the go at once, and you're always sort of trying to plan your workflow so that there is another interview lined up for when this one finishes. But once you've got to that point, you'll send them a letter in the post, which typically tells them a little bit about the project, explains why you want to interview them in particular.
In order to prepare for the interviews, it was necessary to read some of the scientists' papers and, if it was available, secondary literature on that area of science. I think what's important to realise is that part of the reason for the preparation is to identify gaps in what's already been said and been said in, for example, a scientist's published papers. What don't scientists tell you in their published papers about what they do? Very often they don't tell you everyone who was there when they were doing that science. Often they don't tell you how the pieces of equipment were used. Often they don't tell you what else was going on in their life at the same time. Well, of course they don't. Also, where you've got scientists who are to some extent famous, you will have biographies and perhaps even autobiographies. And it's necessary to read those so that you don't produce a kind of audio book copy of what already exists. The point is to find those parts of their life, those parts of their scientific work that they haven't talked about, and to talk about those.
After a little while, you'll turn up at their house, sometimes their office, generally their house. We quite like to interview people at home. You get an idea of them in their natural environment, surrounded by the things that are to do with them, photographs, books. I really quite like looking around at the books they've got on their shelves. It always gives you an idea of what sort of people they might be. But once you're there, you're sort of sat down in their living room and you'll start off the interview after a little preparatory chat. And typically we'll start off in childhood, so early memories, talking about your parents, your education, where do you come from? And essentially it's quite a conversational process. I'll be asking them questions, I'll be nudging them in certain directions, they'll be telling me their story as they see it, I'll be encouraging a different point of view from time to time, and sort of guiding the conversation in areas that I think historians might find interesting in future, and often areas that I just find interesting on a whim that particular day. We're very interested in the nitty-gritty of daily life. Sometimes I think you have to ask people to sort of put things in a bigger context, tell me about the broad historical sweep of that thing you're involved in. But then really sort of trying to narrow it down to specific examples, specific days in the office, little anecdotes that really give us an insight into the world that they are actually inhabiting. And then trying to expand out from that, asking them to reflect on it, asking for extra descriptions, details, procedures. That machine you mentioned a few minutes ago, how do you actually use it? That hideously complicated technical process you've just described to me, how are you measuring it? What's the output look like on your meter? And essentially, you'll sort of trace through the various aspects of a person's career in this sort of way, moving from job to job. But at the same time, you're also trying to get an idea of, what else is there in life? What's your life outside work? What sort of hobbies do you have? In many cases, scientists' hobbies seem to be their work. It's either work on a small scale, it's doing a little bit of science at home. It's occasionally having slightly interesting hobbies that are nothing at all to do with the science, which is often quite interesting. Boris Dancing Rocket Scientist, I think, is probably my favourite. And then finally finishing off by asking them a little bit about the interview itself, how they found it. Now, along the way, I'll have been writing up interview summaries, which are sort of little potted indexes of the interview sessions as they're going along. At the end, I'll complete that. I'll liaise with the interviewees to sort out all the assorted spellings that need sorting out. Typically, name spellings are always an absolute nightmare. And then I will get the interview transcribed with the help of all the people who work in the archiving side of things at the British Library.
The interview would have been recorded on a digital recorder like this. Once it arrives, we upload the files from the compact flash card to the PC through a program called Blackbush, which checksums the files as they're coming off the card onto the computer. And that verifies that the files that we're copying are an exact copy. At this point, we formally accession it into the collections by naming it according to the collection and the interview of which it's a part. And we then make MP3 versions of the WAV file so that we can provide access to it in the British Library reading rooms and via British Library Sounds.
We never delete anything, which some people find a little strange, but it's to do with maintaining the integrity of the whole. But we do allow people the chance to lock things up for 30 years, over frank reactions about colleagues, for instance, that sort of thing, which often I don't think is actually that big a deal, really, in the big historical sweep of things, but it means something to them, and that's quite important, I think. And once that's been completed, the interview is, it's stored for posterity.
We back up the WAV files to a server before they go to the British Library's digital library system for long-term storage.